Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about digital comics and the end of Comixology. I don't know where I'm going to go with this video because I'm not going to just rag on Amazon the whole goddamn time because it's too easy to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the silver lining or the light at the end of the tunnel and see if we can make the most of a bad situation. But before I do that, I'm going to get into the how we got here and where we go forward. And I'm not going to talk about the business decisions of Amazon and the former owners of Comixology either. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about why did digital comics come into existence and prominence in the first place, and why is their eventual dominance what's the word I'm looking for? Inevitable. That's the word I was looking for. This is, what's the purple guy with the rings in the Avengers called? Thanos? This is Thanos saying it is inevitable. Digital comics are the future. And it's unavoidable, and it will happen. There will come a time when print comics cease to exist. And I'm going to explain why. So comic books got their start in the newspaper industry. A lot of people don't know this. They start, those comics pages you have in the middle of your newspaper? That's where most of your comic book stories started. Even Superman and Batman used to exist in the comics pages of your local newspaper. They were syndicated, of course, but your daily newspaper, your local town's newspaper, used to be a very successful business. And as such, this meant that there were ample print shops around the country. We have an excess print shop, so there was plenty of business, which meant there was plenty of competition, which kept costs down. And it was this way for almost 100 years. Almost. But it didn't quite make 100 years. I'd say about 75, 80 years, and then, the shit hit the fan. With the rise of the internet, whereas websites and social media slowly but surely started to replace your local newspaper and magazines as well, this caused a downward spiral. And what that did was newspapers either went all digital or they had to shut down entirely, which meant that was one less print shop. Every newspaper that closed was one less print shop in the country. As a result, the print industry adapted. And what they did was they opened up independent print shops that would print local newspapers for a small fee to help them stay in business, so they didn't have to print them themselves, so that small town newspapers could keep going, save money. And so for a time, this worked. And I say for a time because eventually two things happened. The first thing that happened doesn't get talked about a lot, but we're running out of trees in this world. And specifically, we're running low on the trees that make paper pulp. So the price of paper has gone through the roof. And I worked at a newspaper where this was an active discussion we were constantly having with management. What do we do about paper costs? Because we can't keep, hunting for another printer that can do it for less money, because eventually you hit rock bottom and you don't want to get your paper printed in India, because by then it's not a once a week newspaper, it's a once a month newspaper because of how long it takes to get shit shipped from India. You can't be a daily newspaper if you're shipping your product overseas, which means we can't do what manufacturing has done and outsource to third world countries to save money. That's not an option for the print industry. We tried that. We tried outsourcing to Canada, and then they got overwhelmed, and lo and behold, their print shops started folding. So this wasn't a viable solution. As a trickle down of that, an extension of that, print shops are going out of business left and right. I used to work at a newspaper, I will not identify, that was a daily newspaper in north central Texas. This newspaper did not just print their own publication, which they had multiple publications. They had daily newspapers, they had the ad flyer, the classified flyer that you got in the mail. They had a magazine that they published. They had all kinds of other publications they published, calendars and everything else. So this was a full print shop. They had a full thriving print business. They also printed newspapers, other newspapers who couldn't afford to go out of state to find a print shop, so they would print there. Once COVID hit and shut down the world, advertisers stopped spending money, which meant newspapers no longer had a revenue stream. So they had to cut costs. And when I say cut costs, I mean they had to slash costs. And so this newspaper, like thousands of others all across the world, folded. Now the publication itself still exists, but it is not printed in that print shop. That print shop has since shut down, which means all those publications had to look for elsewhere to get their publications printed. This also means that newspaper no longer has a physical presence in the local community. It's now outsourced. It's produced off, digitally, off-site by people working from home, who some of them don't even live in the community at all. Which means print shops are disappearing. So printers, book printers, comic book printers, magazines, etc., are finding fewer and fewer places to get their publications printed, on top of a paper shortage, which means costs are going up, advertising dollars are going down, and if you're anything at all good at math, you know that means trouble, because it means it costs more money to make the books, but they're making less money on the books, which means they either have to, one, print fewer books, which, means selling smaller numbers, which means charging less for advertising, and that's a downward spiral that ends in bankruptcy. Or, as they have done, shift to digital. Now, those newspapers I was talking about, and specifically that one I worked at, does have a viable digital presence. I was the digital editor of that newspaper. It was my job to make sure we had a digital presence. So it was my job to maintain the website. It was my job to put content on social media, as well as YouTube, etc. I don't work there anymore, so I don't know who's doing it now, but I don't care because I don't work there anymore. But they had a thriving digital presence at the time I worked there. I don't know what it's like now, but their website still functions, so I assume that they still have a digital presence. And this takes me back to Comixology and digital comics. Marvel has the benefit of being owned by Disney, which means Marvel can basically negotiate better print contracts with printers than smaller publications can. So Marvel can still have and maintain a physical presence in the market while also promoting their digital product, which last time I checked was a mixture of Comixology, which no longer exists, has been folded into Kindle Unlimited, as well as Marvel Unlimited, which I don't know if it even still exists itself. I don't know. So, I haven't been following the news. So let's just assume Marvel has a digital presence side by side their physical presence. Marvel, owned by Disney, they have the money and the clout and the resources to weather the storm, as does DC, who is owned by Warner Discovery, who also has billions and billions of dollars in the bank, and also likewise has clout. So as print shops disappear, Marvel and DC can negotiate for better deals. They can get in, ahead of some other publications because they're a big contract. And any print shop trying to stay in business is going to say yes to whatever Disney demands just to get the contract. They have no choice because they can't make their ends meet off of your small town newspaper that only prints one issue a week, because that ain't going to pay the fucking bills anymore, because there's just not enough of those small town weekly newspapers left in the world. So this does hurt indie comics more than anything. And as we've seen, indie comics have found a home on Comixology. Comixology actually did, during its independent days especially, but also under Amazon's management, did a fairly good job promoting indie comics. Now, Archie Comics is a big publisher like Marvel and DC. Archie, on the other hand, doesn't have... they're not a mega conglomerate like those two are. So while they have migrated entirely digital, not entirely digital meaning they don't have a print product anymore, because I believe they still do, but all of their titles are available digitally on what was Comixology, which is now Kindle Unlimited. Again, I don't know. I haven't read anything that suggests this would have changed or not. And I canceled my Comixology subscription when I found out that the app was going to go away. I just canceled my subscription because I'm not paying for something. I'm not paying for fucking Kindle Unlimited. I'll just put it that way. I'm not using their app to read comics. So this puts me in a position where I'm basically SOL. On the other end of the spectrum is retail presence. And likewise, back in the old days, up till about the mid-90s, comic books were everywhere. You could buy comic books at your local gas station. You could buy comic books at your local bookstore. You could buy comic books at your local grocery store, your department store, your dollar store. Everybody sold comic books. Today, you're lucky if your local comic book shop still sells comics and isn't just a Funko Pop store now. You're damn lucky if that's still the case. And even then, most of the time, they mostly only carry the big stuff and a small assortment of the indie stuff as best as they can to stay in business, from the comic book shops I'm familiar with. This isn't to say all comic book shops. Obviously, some of them are doing really well, but there are whole markets where comic book stores used to have a big presence that no longer exist. And I live in a city of 50,000 people, and there's not one store, not one local store that sells comics. No grocery store, no department store, no bookstore, nothing. We have no comic book shop, nothing. Marvel, DC, etc. They do not have a physical presence in the city of 50,000 people. Barnes & Noble still sells manga, and they still sell some collected editions like trade paperbacks and such, but the floppies don't exist. I've looked everywhere. I've gone everywhere. I've talked to people in the local community. You cannot buy... There is nobody that does Free Comic Book Day in town. There's nobody that does it. And there's nobody that sells individual issues, the floppies. Nobody does. And I know this is the case in other cities, because I've lived in those cities. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised to learn Dallas still had more than one comic book shop. And I lived in a suburb of Dallas that happened to have a damn good comic book shop. So while I was living in Dallas, I was pretty happy because I had a local comic book shop that was doing really well. Yes, it was 75% Funko Pops, but their comic selection was still pretty good, pretty robust. Obviously, if they weren't selling Funko Pops, they probably would have gone out of business. But that's another story for another day. Funko Pops, I believe, are eventually going to fade from popularity, and then what are we going to do? I don't know. You know, just ask Pogs how viable that business is. Or hell, trading cards. Those have more or less disappeared from the market. I say more or less. They still kind of exist, but not like they did in the 90s. So yeah. Here we are. So what's the future look like? Unfortunately, the future is digital. And it's inevitable. And I say inevitable because eventually the few remaining print shops that exist will no longer exist, and there will be nowhere to print books. Once we get to a point where it is physically impossible to print books because literally nobody exists with the capability of printing books, you know, just like it is currently impossible to get film developed because there's nobody left in the world that develops film, so film cameras are obsolete, 100% obsolete, because you can't develop, unless, of course, you have, you know, a dark room in your basement and you can develop it yourself. You can kind of do that with film, you know, I mean, that was always a thing. You have a much harder time doing that with a comic book. Even Amazon print on demand, which I will talk about, is eventually going to go away. And the reason why I say that is because eventually even Amazon will run out of print shops to use. Even though they may currently at this moment in time own their own print shops, that's not always going to be the case. because there's going to come a time where they can no longer afford the paper costs nor the labor costs to maintain those warehouses. So, what's the future going to look like? Well, in an ideal world, we would have somebody else step up and replace Comixology with a better option. However, the problem with that scenario is that company's not going to have the resources to compete with Amazon, which means they're going to have a hard time getting a foothold in the market, which means they're going to have trouble getting titles for people to read, and they're going to have a trouble persuading customers and subscribers to sign up because of a lack of titles, which is going to make it very difficult for a third-party app to rise to existence. Not to say third-party apps don't exist, because I believe they still do. And I don't think we're going to go the streaming route where like all movie studios today have their own streaming service. I don't think we're going to get to a point where all indie comic publishers have their own indie comic streaming platform, because that's not viable. No one's going to pay $300 a month for 17 comic book streaming digital services to read all their comics. That no one's going to do that. Kevin Smith isn't going to do that, and he's the only one in the world that's got the money to do it. So the answer is I don't know. I do know that the digital future, at least in terms of comics, just like newspapers and magazines, is going to eventually be 100% digital. Physical comics, I'm not going to put a time frame on it, but physical comics will eventually cease to exist. That is inevitable. That will happen. Nothing is going to stop that from happening. How long it takes to happen is up in the air. If I was a gambling person, which I grew up in Nevada, so I don't like to gamble, but if I was going to take a wild guess, I would give it 15 years tops. And that's only because Disney and DC have the money to sink into it. If we were going based on what's left of the print industry, People Magazine, Game Informer just went all digital, by the way, that you can't get physical Game Informers anymore. They just told me that when I went into GameStop. So you don't even get a physical Game Informer magazine anymore. It's a PDF now. So eventually, it's going to be cost prohibitive to print floppies, and no one's going to pay $25 for a single issue of Spider-Man. No one's going to do that, and that's what it's eventually going to cost, because the shortage of paper with the having to bid on print jobs, which we're seeing with Dungeons and Dragons, by the way. Hasbro had to scale back the number of books they were going to print because there's not enough printers to print the books. And the print shop, not that newspaper I used to work at, the daily newspaper I used to work at, that print shop went out of business. The weekly paper I worked at before them, the print shop where they got printed also went out of business, so they had to go out of state to get printed. I don't know if that print shop is still in business or how much longer it's going to be in business. But that's two print shops that I know about that were local to Texas that are no longer there. And I'm fairly certain, I am 99% certain that scenario is playing out across the country. Because I've been reading about it. And I know people in the publications business who have been telling me that this is, in fact, the way it's going. They keep having to drive further and further to get their publication printed. And they're still struggling to find a digital presence in the market, especially newspapers, because of Facebook and Twitter. They have pretty much killed the local news market. Because information spreads faster on social media than it ever did in newspapers. Not to mention the 24-hour news cycle brought on by MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, etc. So, what's the future look like? Eventually, all digital. 100% digital. Eventually. Now, we may still see trade paperbacks and graphic novels get printed in small quantities because those are specialty books, and I think books themselves are going to stick around a while. And remember, a print shop that is formatted to print books isn't necessarily going to be formatted to print comic books. Now, a print shop that prints newspapers absolutely has the capability of printing comic books because it's the same goddamn thing. It's the same process. A newspaper and a comic book, as far as a printer goes, there is no difference between one book to the other. It's the same it's the same thing. So printing a comic book at a newspaper printer is easy to do. Printing a comic book at a book printer is much harder to do because they just don't have the print lines for that. They don't have the printing press for that. Just like the print shops that made CDs, converted to DVDs, converted to Blu-ray, and were able to stay in business, the print shops that made Laserdisc and vinyl records went out of business, which has made bringing back vinyl records very difficult. And there's not very many places that can print vinyl records, and nobody's printing Laserdiscs anymore. So bringing that back is going to be next to impossible, which is the same reason why VHS manufacturing no longer exists. Because the factories who did it either went out of business or converted to discs and just shifted the market. And again, the manufacturing machinery to make a CD is the exact same machinery to make a DVD as it is a Blu-ray, as it is an HD DVD, as it is a 4K Blu-ray. It's the same machine. It's the exact same machine. They never had to upgrade. But the machine that makes a newspaper is not the same machine that makes a trade paperback. Those are two different machines. Now, the machine that makes a book is the same machine that can make a trade paperback. You can make a trade paperback, depending on formatting, on the same machine you make paperback books on. So I believe trade paperbacks will live on longer, as will graphic novels, but we're going to get to a point where floppies are gone. They won't exist anymore. They will no longer be an option. When we get there, I can't say for sure. Now, Disney and Marvel do have the money, or Disney and DC, I should say, Marvel and DC, do have the money. If they wanted to, they could open their own print shop and print comics themselves. It's just a matter of how long before that is no longer profitable for them, before they shut that down, you know? But your local indie publication that does one issue a month and only does 500 issues at a time, they do not have the money to open their own print shop and buy their own printing press equipment and hire press operators, which are industrial jobs, which means 1, unions, and 2, high paychecks. Yes, those are not cheap labor. So your local indie comic doesn't have the resources to print themselves, so they have no choice but to print at an established print firm. And once that print firm is gone and is no longer an option, that indie comic is either 1, out of business, or 2, no choice but to go digital only. And of course, indie comics, digital indie comics, web comics as well, do exist and are thriving. I do not see any evidence that there's going to be a resurgence in print manufacturing in the near future, especially if paper continues to be a problem. Because newspapers are already printed on recycled paper, so there's nothing they can do to cut costs any further. They've already cut costs as much as they can. So that's, I don't know if comic books are printed on recycled paper, but maybe that's a route they go if they're not currently. Maybe that's how they save money in the future and prolong the inevitable. I don't know, because I don't know the ins and outs of the comic book side of publication, because I've never worked for a publication that made comic books. So what is the answer? I don't know. I mean, it is digital. Digital's the answer. But when we get there, and what's that look like, I don't know. Because I don't see people paying $60 a month for 4 or 5 different comic book streaming services like they will with Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu, etc. Because people, as a whole, are more willing to watch movies and TV shows than they are to read comic books. And a lot of comic fans, and I've heard, I myself have gone this route, and I know a lot of other comic fans who've gone this route, have found sufficient alternatives in not only the digital alternative, but the films and TV shows. You don't have to read Marvel Comics to keep up with Marvel Comics. You can watch the Disney Plus movies and TV shows, the MCU. Same with DC. You don't have to read DC Comics to keep up with DC Comics. You can just watch the animated stuff and the TV shows, which are all damn good. So you can get your comics fix today without reading comic books, which again is digital. You know, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, Hulu, those are digital platforms. You know? So, yeah, the all digital world, at least in terms of comic books, is 1000% inevitable. It's just a matter of time before we get there. And what does that look like? As far as Comixology going the way of the dodo, yeah, I will not pay for Kindle Unlimited because I don't read ebooks. I read physical books. And if I ever get to a point where I can't buy a book, I have to read a PDF, I ain't doing it. I will never do it. That's when I'm done buying new books. I'll just stick to the classics because we've got 10,000 years of human books to read. I'm not going to run out of shit to read. Not in 17 lifetimes. As far as comic book collectors go, yeah, the aftermarket is going to thrive. So that will keep some comic book shops going. Because there's always going to be collectors who want the old stuff. And there's ample old stuff currently to keep the collector market going for another 30 years. If we stop publishing print comics today, there's enough print comics in existence to keep a comic book collector busy for 2 lifetimes at least, maybe 3. So we're not going to run out of that. So comic book shops at least have that, if nothing else. And by and large, comic book readers have mostly shifted to trade paperbacks and graphic novels anyways. I don't buy floppies month to month anymore. I canceled all my subscriptions, and now I wait for the trade paperback or the graphic novel, and that's all I buy. That's it. I only buy trade paperbacks and graphic novels now. And I suspect a lot of comic book readers are going to go that way, if they haven't already. So yeah, your local comic book shop will still be able to sell you trade paperbacks and graphic novels for a much longer time than they'll be able to sell you new editions of floppies.